Welcome to the development unit. In this video, we'll cover early brain development, Piaget's stage theory, and the effects of learning on development. I've updated the PsychBoost app. Now it has over 500 GCSE flashcards, over 400 multiple choice quiz questions, and over 300 key terms to test your knowledge with. Of course, all based on the information I cover in these videos. I'm so confident you'll like my app. You can use all the features for Paper 1 for free. Only subscribe to Paper 2 if you know you'll find it helpful. You can also follow along with these videos by completing my worksheets, available on Patreon. Early brain development. When we think about the earliest stage of brain development, we start with a long and extended neural tube. The front of this tube then swells out into three sections: the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. The back of the tube will then form the spine. Now, this process is called differentiation. What will happen to those early structures is as follows. The forebrain will develop into the largest section of the brain, called the cerebellum, or the cerebral cortex. The thalamus also comes from the forebrain. The midbrain eventually develops into part of the brainstem, and the hindbrain develops into a structure called the cerebellum, as well as the rest of the brainstem. And as I've said, the back of the neural tube becomes the spinal cord. At around 6 months into pregnancy, the brain is very similar structurally to the adult brain, with as many neurons. There are certain brain areas mentioned in the specification, and you can see them all on this diagram. Let's talk in a little more detail about each of these. So we have the cerebellum at the top of the brain. It's the largest structure, and it's split into two halves, a right side and a left side, called cerebral hemispheres. You can see the cerebellum here, from the top down, from the side, and sliced from the front, top to bottom. The cortex is the outer 2 to 4 millimeter surface layer of the brain. It's folded for extra surface area and contains mostly cell bodies. Each cerebral hemisphere can be divided into 4 lobes. We should be able to name them and have an understanding of their basic functions. The frontal lobe is responsible for thought and planning, as well as social behavior like your facial expressions. The parietal lobe is used for touch sensors and bringing information from other parts of the brain together. The occipital lobe is for visual information, and the temporal lobe is for understanding spoken language. If we cut the brain in half, we can see the thalamus, one on each side of the brain in the center. The thalamus acts as a hub of information, sending sensory information to the correct areas of the cortex. The brain stem is at the bottom of the brain and connects the brain to the spinal cord and onto the rest of the body's nervous system. It provides basic autonomic functions like keeping your heart beating and regulating your breathing rate. Under the cerebellum, there's a structure called the cerebellum. It's a small kind of wrinkled structure, and it's involved in balance and coordination. So that was a quick guide to early brain structure and some of the neural structures they develop into. We now need to clearly explain all that brain development is linked to function. Let's start by saying in order to carry out a function, the part of the brain responsible for that function needs to develop. You can be asked about 4 functions. So it's important to understand the brain regions that are associated. Autonomic functions are controlled by the brain, but not consciously. Good examples are breathing and heart rate. So the brainstem needs to develop for autonomic functions. Sensory processing requires specialist areas of the cortex and the thalamus acting as a hub to develop. Voluntary movement is controlled consciously by a specialist area of the cerebral cortex called the motor cortex. The cerebellum is also needed to process balance and coordination information. The process of thinking, or cognition, involves planning for the future and solving problems. The development of the frontal lobe is needed for cognitive thinking. So, brain development, like most things in psychology, is determined by a combination of nature and nurture factors. So what do I mean by that? Well, nature is the idea that the brain development is influenced by inherited genetic factors. We do have evidence that genes can even influence factors of the brain such as intelligence, with research showing that people who share genes, such as twins, have similar IQ levels. This suggests the inheritance of genes that code for brain development. Nurture, on the other hand, suggests that brain development results from an interaction with the environment. And there's evidence for this too. Research shows that a fetus's brain can be damaged in the womb if the mother abuses drugs or alcohol while pregnant. But most psychologists take the interactionist approach, that there's a complex combination of both nurture and nature influences that create the developing brain. Piaget's stage theory. Jean Piaget was a famous psychologist in the field of childhood development, and he had a theory about how children develop cognitively. Piaget thought it wasn't just that children haven't yet learned how to think about the things adults think about, but that they think in completely different ways. So, for example, adults can think logically, can see the world from others' perspective, and can think about abstract concepts. According to Piaget, children simply can't do those things because their brains have not yet matured to a stage of cognitive development that allows those kind of thoughts. Let me quickly define two words that will be important. That's logical thinking, which is considering the relationship between facts and then coming to conclusions that make sense. So if I said I had 3 apples, 2 pears, and 3 sweets, then how many pieces of fruit do I have? You can quickly understand the fact that apples and pears are fruit, but sweets are not, come to the conclusion that I have 5 pieces of fruit. Abstract concepts are ideas that don't have any physical form, so morals, mathematics, and beauty. That's opposed to concrete concepts that you can point at, like apples. So as they grow, children do learn about the world, and Piaget suggests that they do this by developing schema. I've mentioned schema before, so you might have guessed that they're a pretty big idea in cognitive psychology. But to explain schema again, they're packages or structures of information about things in the world. We develop our schema through experience. New experiences can cause us to add to our schema, or in some cases, make an entirely new schema. And this leads us to 2 words about how Piaget thought children develop schema: assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation is a small change when we add new information to an existing schema. So a child who's only had experience with their own black cat seeing a ginger cat will add this information to their cat schema. Cats can be black or ginger. Accommodation is the changing of the schema itself to match the new information. So a child visiting the zoo and seeing lions and tigers will need to reconsider what a cat is, or make a totally new schema of big cats. Piaget broke down the cognitive development of children's brains down to 4 distinct stages. Firstly, sensorimotor. Between 0 and 2 years old, babies are just first learning how to control their bodies. They're interacting with sensory information, and at this stage develop object permanence, meaning they start to understand that an object still exists, even if it's hidden from view. The second stage is pre-operational. This is between 2 and 7 years old. Children lack the ability to think logically at this stage. They don't understand conservation, that the amount or volume of an object remains the same even if how it's displayed changes. They're also egocentric, meaning that they only see the world from their own perspective. Piaget demonstrated young children's inability to conserve using glasses of water. When water was poured from a wide glass into a thinner glass, children would say there was more water in the thinner glass. The third stage is concrete operational, and children at this stage from 7 to 11 years old. At this stage, egocentrism is lessened, meaning they can now see the world from others' perspective. Children can also do better on tasks of conservation. They can start to use logical thinking about and using physical objects around them, but they struggle thinking logically about abstract concepts. And the final stage, formal operational, at 11 years and older, children at this stage should now be able to use logical reasoning about abstract concepts, working out mathematical and logic questions in their heads. So those are the stages of development according to Piaget. We do need to be able to consider how those stages can be applied to education. As young children are developing schema, the teaching in primary schools should be child-centered, with teachers providing interesting resources and experiences, but the children can develop their own schema using play, discovery, and trial and error. As the children are passing through stages and might be incapable of some tasks, teachers should consider a child's readiness for some classroom challenges. Teachers could also keep in mind that children in the same class might be at different stages of cognitive development, so there should be a range of appropriate classroom activities available. So let's evaluate Piaget. His work has undeniably been influential. It's been applied to early education in many countries, with teachers focusing less on rote learning and more on discovery. Children are asked to complete tasks based on readiness and encouraged to develop their own schema. But there are criticisms of Piaget. The stages suggested by Piaget don't match the development of all children. He thought all children would achieve the formal operational stage. But some people are never able to use logical reasoning to think abstractly. And also shown by research we're about to cover, Piaget seems to have underestimated children's abilities. It's thought that some of the original methods used by Piaget were a bit confusing to the children. And there are issues with Piaget's sample. They were all middle-class children from Switzerland. It's likely that his findings lack generalizability to childhood development in other cultures and social classes, who may pass through the stages at different points or have other identifiable stages. So I mentioned research that counters Piaget's work. The first one to look at is the Naughty Teddy study by McGarrell and Donaldson. We just covered conservation, understanding that quantity remains the same even when how it's displayed changes. And I gave the example of pouring water between glasses. While in a variation, Piaget used counters. He moved a set of counters closer together, and the children often said that there were fewer counters. While McGarrigle and Donaldson thought that the children seeing you intentionally moving the counters and then asking if the number of counters had changed sets the children up to say that they had. In other words, the children's behaviour was influenced by the actions of the researcher, so not valid. So they decided to set up a similar study, but instead of the researcher moving the counters, a naughty Teddy would do it accidentally. They used 80 children, all between 4 and 6, from Scottish nurseries and primary schools. In one condition, the experimenter moved the counters closer intentionally, and in another, the naughty Teddy accidentally moved them. The researchers found that when the experimenter moved the counters, only 13 children, 16%, were able to conserve, but in the naughty Teddy condition, 50 children, or 63%, were able to conserve and answered correctly that there were the same numbers of counters. So the researchers concluded that Piaget influenced the behaviour of the children in his original study and then underestimated young children's ability to conserve. So when we come to evaluate McGarrigle and Donaldson, a positive is they successfully challenged a pre-existing view on the limitations of children's cognitive development based on Piaget's ideas. Their studies also been replicated by other researchers. However, the results were not quite as strong as the original Naughty Teddy study. However, 30% of children were still unable to conserve in the Naughty Teddy condition. This shows that a large number of children do struggle with conservation until 7. This is partial support for Piaget's theories. The sample used in the Naughty Teddy study were all from a range of Scottish nurseries. It could be a variation in early years education between the nurseries could have influenced the results. Now, Piaget's ideas on the development of egocentricity has also been challenged by Hughes in the policeman doll study. Piaget showed that pre-operational children struggle to decenter with the Three Mountains study. He sat children down in front of a three-dimensional model of 3 mountains, with a doll on the other side. When asked to pick from images what the doll could see, younger children picked the image with their view, and older children picked the image with the doll's view. But Hughes thought that the 3 mountains task was confusing to young children, and made them appear more egocentric than they actually were. So he designed a study to test Piaget's theory with a more understandable social context. 30 children between 3 and 5 years old were shown a model of 2 walls forming a cross. 2 dolls were used, a policeman doll and a boy doll. The experimenter placed the policeman doll on one side so he could see into 2 of the sections of the wall. The experimenter then placed the boy doll, asking each time if the policeman doll could see him. In the second part of the experiment, the researcher used 2 policeman dolls and asked the child to place the boy doll in the section where the policeman dolls couldn't see him. The results were 90% of the children could successfully hide the boy doll from both of the policeman dolls. Hughes concluded from these results that the Three Mountains studies was poorly designed, and young children are less egocentric than previously thought. So when evaluating Hughes, we can say his study also successfully countered ideas developed by Piaget on the limitations of young children's cognitive abilities. But we can be concerned with investigator effects in this study. It may be that the researcher unintentionally gave hints about the correct response. Also, the study had more than one stage, so it might have been that the child was being trained to answer correctly. Both of these issues could reduce the study's internal validity. It may not have measured egocentrism, but the effects of practice and the investigator. The effects of learning on development. We're going to start with a topic that you're probably familiar with due to its use in schools in the last few years, and that's Dweck's mindset theory. This theory is about motivation. It tries to explain by how changing motivation students can be more academically successful. To do that, it classifies students as either having a growth or a fixed mindset. Fixed mindset students see ability as something outside of their control. They think it's set at birth, so genetic, and if they face a task that's difficult for them, they assume they're not able to overcome the challenge, so they give up. Growth mindset students see ability as something that is in their control. They can improve by learning and practice. If they face a challenge, they're going to be less likely to give up, assuming that they're going to be successful if they keep working hard enough. Now, the theory suggests that people are not just completely one or the other, they are somewhere in between, with only a few people at the extreme ends. Also, if you have a growth or fixed mindset, can depend on the context. Now, the role of praise is thought to be important in developing a growth mindset. If parents and teachers only ever praise success, that can be problematic. If people only praise for success, people who are not praised may think that successful people are just naturally better and they can't compete. But if praise is given for effort, it's possible for everyone to increase their effort. So that increased effort leads to increased success. Another aspect of praise, according to Dweck, is that praise should be seen as meaningful. So not just giving out all the time for low effort to make people feel better. The term self-efficacy means a person's self-belief that they can actually succeed at a task. Self-efficacy of the students can be developed by teachers by creating classroom experiences in which students achieve success with their tasks. So you design tasks that are challenging, but possible for that particular student or group of students to complete. That way, they get used to succeeding and expecting to succeed. There is experimental evidence that supports Dweck's mindset theory. In one of Dweck's own studies, she showed that 10 to 12-year-old students who were praised for effort rather than intelligence on a task then went on to be more persistent and show more enjoyment on a follow-up task. Dweck's theory also clearly has practical applications. It provides guidance to teachers on how to help their students achieve academically. For example, using process-oriented praise when giving feedback on work. But there are criticisms of Dweck's work. By focusing on the students having the correct mindset for success, people in charge of education can ignore reasons outside of the control of students for underperformance. There are cultural reasons for poor performance, under-resourced schools, and poor teaching. Dweck's theory potentially blames underprivileged children for their own underperformance. And research that looks at the application of Dweck's research in schools has shown very limited improvement in school performance. This could be a problem with the theory, or it could be a problem in implementing it properly in schools. Now, before Dweck's mindset theory became popular, the hot idea in schools was learning styles. Now, the idea behind learning styles was people are individuals, and they vary in the way they take in and process information. So it was suggested that teachers should try and match each student's learning style with an appropriate classroom activity. There are a few variations of learning styles, but the one we'll talk about had verbalizers and visualizers. So, if you're classified as a verbalizer, you were thought to process information better audibly, so in the form of words. The words could be written out or they could be spoken by the teacher. And it was thought that verbalizers had difficulty processing visual information. On the other hand, if you were classified as a visualizer, you were thought to process information better visually, so in the form of images, pictures, diagrams, and graphs. And for revision would do tasks like making mind maps. And it was suggested by learning theory that visualizers would find it more difficult to process information in the form of words. I'm going to give a positive evaluation here because what follows will be a very long criticism that we can use if we're going to negatively evaluate learning styles. So the positive learning styles is, it was seen as modernizing teaching, moving away from a one-size-fits-all rote learning approach. It made teachers focus more on the individual needs of the students and use more varied teaching styles in the classroom. Where a researcher called Willingham is very critical of learning styles. Willingham thought that learning styles don't improve children's learning, and trying to match a task to a child's preferred learning style was just counterproductive. If a child struggles either visually or verbally, they should be given more opportunities to practice that skill, of using more of that type of information, not less. So Willingham's learning theory states that the most appropriate task for teaching children should be the one that matches the content, not the child's learning style. If teaching maps and geography, or art, or graphs and maths, use visual tasks. If teaching essay structure or language, use words. By giving children a range of tasks, they'll improve with visual and verbal skills that they will be required to use in the future, like at work. Willingham did think that education should be informed by psychology, but by more scientific, cognitive, and neuroscience studies on learning. Willingham also suggests that the main focus to judge effective learning wasn't the style used at all, but if the students actually remembered the information. There's a large amount of evidence to support Willingham's argument that learning styles is not effective, and there are very few studies that actually support learning styles. Willingham's ideas have been influential for teaching. He has ideas for improving teaching, and his effective countering of learning theories has saved teachers time from having to convert classes into multiple different learning styles. But some people criticize Willingham as rejecting modern forms of teaching and focusing too much on uncreative traditional rote learning. I want to thank all my patrons for their support. They allow me to work part-time and make PsychBoost, and in return, they get extra resources. For example, GCSE patrons get digital worksheets, exam question walkthroughs, and these videos as a set of teaching slides.